I think the beauty in the 7-page small story is that like you can start figuring out what you need and what you don't, and like kind of strip it down to like the bare essentials of what makes a story good.
Welcome back to Inspired Inc., the Comics Wellspring podcast, a show where we promote indie comic creators and become inspired by what they create and their journey of creating it. I'm your host, Brandon Bloxdorf, and today on the show, we have William Keops Ibanez joining us, and we talk about why experiencing the process of making a comic is the most vital lesson you can learn, how real-life figure drawing can transform you as a creator, and why we should study the greats to become better storytellers. All this and so much more on today's Inspired Inc. What brought you to the West Coast? I mean, East Coast.
So when I was in high school, I actually already knew that I wanted to go to a comic book college or comic book trade school. I was looking at the Kubert School, and when I found out that the School of Visual Arts in New York City offered a bachelor's program in comic book illustration, that became my first choice. And I think I applied really early in high school, and I got accepted, and it was just I came straight over here. So
oh man, that's rad.
They had a really good professors. Klaus Janson taught there when I was there. Gary Panter, David Mazzucchelli. So when I found out these were going to be the teachers there, I jumped at the chance. You know, I really focused on getting good grades so that I could get accepted, and I've been here ever since. So.
Nice. Dude, that's so awesome. Do you have like a bit of advice maybe one or two of those teachers gave you that really helped shape you as a creator? Or maybe even a lesson?
I mean, like, they were so different. Like, I couldn't give you like one thing that like maybe that they all could have in common, because Gary Panter's like very underground and like punk, and Klaus Janson's like more mainstream. He's drawn for Marvel and DC. So their like techniques for teaching and advice is completely on polar opposites. But the one thing I would say that I did get like overall my 4 years there was that you should just make a comic book, no matter what your drawing style is, no matter at what level your drawing style is. Like, I know people tend to focus on anatomy and like getting your perspective and your proportions correct. But even if you get all that done, like if you've never sat down and made like one 24-page comic, if you don't sit down and do that, like from beginning to end, a 24-page comic, you're not gonna be able to kind of like learn all the lessons that are required for storytelling, for narrative, like no matter how good your drawing is. So I would say that like they really forced you to like sit down, make a 7-page story, make a 24-page story, even if your drawing is not like at the highest level. I think that would help any beginner like more than anything. Like, you could get all the anatomy books, you could get Loomis, you could get George Bridgman, but if you don't sit down and make a 24-page comic and the only thing you're good at is drawing pinups, you're not gonna break into the industry, and so I would say that, yeah, sit down and make a 24-page comic, even if it's a mini comic, hand stapled, like even if it's stick figures. Like, I think that like getting the whole like process down is a huge learning experience.
Oh, I love that. I love that so much. I was just talking to a creator recently on an episode where we're kind of saying like, you could do covers and these pinups all you want and, mock a design, maybe a comic book panel or stuff like that. But like, until you figure out how to do sequential storytelling and experiment and play in that sandbox, it's a different realm. Like going from, covers and pinups to sequential art, two different almost like mediums in a general, like two different genres practically, because the thought process and the movements and the setups and the what goes to keep your eye going from this 1-2 panel to down to the next one and being fluid, all those aspects you kind of need to like dive in and figure out for yourself. Paneling is so wild and insane, and you can do so much with it or do so little with it. But you do need to like figure out like, if I'm not going to be doing some insane J.H. Williams III, like paneling on this, even just doing your 9-panel, 6-panel, block grid, that's going to teach you a whole lot just in itself, because even that is a challenge.
Yeah.
What do you think part of making comics and doing that sequential art, what makes that so challenging for people?
I think it's just telling a story. A lot of people think it's drawing pretty pictures, but when you have to sit down, especially if you're working from a script, like
Hmm.
a lot of cartoonists like think it's drawing, and then like they don't take a writing class, or they don't read literature outside of comic books. It's a whole different ballgame when you have to sit down and like take apart a story that somebody else wrote, or write your own story, right? And it's just like when you sit down and, like I said, make the comic, you realize, wow, it's not just drawing. It really is like you have to figure out how you tell a story, and that's almost part of the challenge for a lot of cartoonists who do both their own drawing and writing. Is you're almost like taking on a whole other like a whole other part of the process is like figuring out the story, right? And like a lot of people who sit down and write, or I'm sorry, draw, like they realize like, hey man, I probably should go read a couple of books outside of comics. That's one thing I do like, that they did tell us is like, don't just read comics. When I was at
Love
SFA,
that.
they told us like, go read a couple of books, like find out how writers like tell a story from beginning, middle, and to end. So I feel like for cartoonists that like have to do both the writing and the drawing, it's more of a challenge. I know Bill Sienkiewicz like has said in the past that like all art aspires to comics, and I definitely agree with that, because you're not just doing drawing, you're not just doing writing, two separate like mediums that require
Hmm.
their own disciplines. Like you're combining both, so it's almost like you have to have your feet in both, disciplines. And so I definitely feel like I took painting classes, and
Oh, cool.
I did for a good chunk of my freshman and sophomore year think to myself, I could do illustration or painting and do the fine arts thing. And I gravitated towards comics because it was just so much more challenging. Like it definitely engaged me more, because I felt like and not that I'm talking down to like the fine arts world with the people that are doing gallery stuff, but it's
Of
like you do
course,
one
yeah.
painting, that's it. You move on to the next one, you do another painting, that's it, and you hang it up on the wall.
Hmm.
And I almost feel like by my sophomore year, I'm like, well, that's it. There's nothing else to it. I mean, I'm sure there's discipline to that too, but it's like sitting down with a comic book and putting it together was definitely more engaging, more of a challenge. So I ended up just kind of not, I don't want to say I gave up on painting, but
Hmm.
I just focused on comics solely after my sophomore year.
Well, that's so cool too, because even if you're really interested in painting, you could bring that into comics. Like there's no
Yeah,
restrictions.
yeah,
And that's the fun thing about comics above almost any other sort of art form, is that you could get all your mixed media and you can make every issue different and play with it different. You can grow in that fine art aspect and still channel it through comics. Like you're right. I do think people forget that, comics is, in some way, a very ultimate and superior form to many art forms, because of just how much goes into it and how
yeah,
much you can manipulate and how much you could, just, pull from inspirations and pull from your own skill sets. And you can grow in like 12 different directions at once. Or you could stay focused and be like, I am a painter and that's it. And of course, we have a lot of fine artists, Jade Lauder, like all sorts of people, Adrian Kolarek, who are fine artists who have studied fine art and came into comics. But that's the thing, they all studied that fine art and then came back to comics and was like, dude, I could do all this and more. Like, this sounds like a
yeah.
lot more fun. Yeah.
It's a lot, yeah, it's a lot more challenging, but it's also like the rewards from like how readers react to the work, right? And I think that's why I also gravitated towards comics. I think I answered this in like the form you had sent,
Mm.
but I do feel like, and that's the thing with like the gallery world, right? Like you have to go to the gallery to experience the art, right? And with comic books, it's you could print as many copies as you want and send it out to like anywhere in the world, and like people have access to it. It's artwork that's definitely more accessible, and
Hmm.
that's one thing that appealed to me about the form. is that like you look at paintings at the Met or at at MoMA, and they're wonderful pieces of work, but a lot of the times like people who aren't in the East Coast next to these galleries with access to these galleries can't experience the art. And then if you want to consume that art, it's like thousands of dollars, right? It's only people who are probably better off that can afford to buy these paintings and hang them up, right? But with
Yeah.
comic books, it's not like that. The final piece of the artwork in a comic book is a printed book, which goes
Hmm.
no more than $10, right? So it's artwork and literature that's accessible to the masses, and that's one thing that like really appealed to me. You can reach a massive audience, and your message could be anything.
I love
There's like
that too.
magic
Yeah.
to that.
Yeah, no, exactly. It's I mean, in a big way, so many creators have brought magic into, making art. And it's one of those things where you're just sending out a signal, you're sending out this wavelength out there and, putting what you're saying, a message into their hands, and it can go anywhere. Anyone can have the same or similar experience. No one's kind of being cheated out of it the way, like what you're describing. I went to the MoMA once and it was the raddest thing in the world, and I could have spent my entire day there just absorbing everything, and that was a great experience and I would love to do it again. But that was a singular experience, whereas like I could turn around and grab a book off my shelf and have like that
Absolutely.
similar comic book thing every
Yeah.
single time. And even with the challenges behind it, like not only is like making a comic challenging, and not only is drawing a comic book challenging, but like you can choose the level of challenge you put yourself onto these comics. You could choose how you're going to spread yourself out, how you're going to make each one different. You could choose what skill set you're going to try to develop each issue, like, oh, I'm bad at this, I want to work at this thing, let me apply that to this here and kind of grow with it. And then the next, book or series issue, you could choose another aspect you want to grow upon and start shaping that skill set. When you chose to go from like comics in particular and drawing, what like literally what drew you into being an artist, and what like really like kick started your artistic career?
I've loved drawing since I was a kid. I mean, as far as I can remember, I my earliest memory is drawing on the walls in my house. Um, like I
Love that.
must have been in kinder or first grade, but I remember drawing with crayons on the walls. And then after that, I just loved watching cartoons. The '80s stuff like Transformers, Ninja Turtles. And at some point, I remember watching like a documentary where they kind of go behind the scenes about how animated shows are made, and that
Oh, cool.
involve drawing, like hand cell animation.
Hmm.
And at that age, I was like, that's what I want to do. I want to draw cartoons. And then from there, I just kept drawing in my sketchbook every day, thinking I was going to get into animation. And I think around like first or second grade, the Marvel trading cards came out. I think it was series two, the ones that I got into. I know there was series one, but series two were the cards like all the kids in my elementary school were collecting.
Nice.
I just bought a ton of them, and I'm like, wow, like I can copy the drawings off of these, and they're like portable little sketches you can put in your pocket, or for the hardcore nerds, it was binders, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But
I have one of those too. I remember those.
yeah,
Yeah.
so I started copying the Marvel trading cards, and they had the little stories in the back. I didn't know they had comic books. But as you collect more and more, you start realizing they have the stories there. And so I ended up trying to look up a comic shop in my local town, and there was one called I don't know if it's still there. It was called Comics, Cards, and Collectibles. Because at that point, I was buying the trading cards at the Circle K or 7-Eleven.
Ah, nice.
So when I found out there was a comic shop, I was like, oh, I can look up the stories that these cards are based on. So that's kind of where I started buying comics, and then from there it was, well, I want to draw comics. I don't want to do animation,
Hmm.
and that's kind of how I got, you know, carried into to like focusing solely on comics. I ended up my mom, God bless her soul, like she ended up like being very supportive of me, and she paid for me to go to private art lessons.
Oh, rad.
And,
That's cool.
yeah, so and that just pretty much pushed me into getting into like, that's it, I'm going to do comics as like this thing I love doing and hopefully make into a career. So
Dude, that's so cool. And I mean, chasing that dream, I mean, for a lot of creators, I majored in creative writing, and that's where, luckily my dad was also just as supportive as like what it sounds like your mom was. I grew up as a musician. He supported me playing music. I switched to being a writer. He supports all of my writing and my comic book endeavors. And, having a figure in your life that helps you like really express yourself like that. And I mean, money is always a concern in life. How to survive is always a concern in life. But I think when you see the passion in someone and you could recognize it, and that like whatever they're going to do, like, oh, this is what they want, and they can encourage that and be there and support it and nurture it, like that means you're going to grow up with success. And that means you're not going to take no for an answer, because you've already kind of been given this like, like what you're saying, like a great like blessing of being like, okay, like if I get this, I got this permission, and if my mom says it's okay, it's cool, guys. Like screw all you guys, I'm gonna do what I want. And it's just such a cool feeling, because you kind of feel unstoppable, and it makes you go like throughout your life knowing like, okay, I've made a decision, I've made a choice, and they believed in me, I should believe in myself. Were your parents or was your mom like a big influence like as you were like becoming an artist as well?
um yeah, I would say so. Like one of my earliest memories was like, and I know this is gonna sound like going back to the 80s. I remember she got me like the Etch a Sketch with, or not the Etch a Sketch. It was the magnet tablet with the magnet stylus.
Yeah, yeah.
I remember having a hard time drawing the Ghostbusters logo. And she sat me down. She's like, "Why are you getting so frustrated?" I'm like, "I can't draw it." She's like, "No, I'm going to show you. It's real easy. Just, you know, you got to look at the logo more than you're looking at the drawing. Like you're just here. You got to look at what you're copying." And she sat down, and like in less than 10 minutes, she did the Ghostbusters logo, and like that was so eye opening for me. And I never considered her an artist, but that was just like so eye opening to see, for someone to sit down and be like, "No, like let me show you." That was pretty eye opening. So in that way, I could say she was an influence. But
Nice.
yeah, she was. I wouldn't say she was like an artist or anything. I never,
Mhm.
outside of that, I never saw her sit down and draw or anything. She was a huge reader, though. I mean, her
Nice.
love for literature was passed down onto me. So she always made sure to read us books. She was always buying us books. So, and that's why I tell people today, like, hey man, if you're gonna get into comics, you gotta not just read comics. You gotta read a couple of books. Like
Yeah, I agree with that so much, man. And I thought it was because I was trying to become a writer and whatnot, and I was like, oh, I need to read all literature instead of just comics. It was kind of like when I was learning music. I wanted to learn every style and not just like metal and punk, because I
oh
knew if
yeah,
I learned,
absolutely. That's
yeah,
definitely true.
it's like, yeah, you gotta like, expand, even if you just dip your toes into it a little bit, a different genre, a different style, like at least get a feel for it. Because if you never do, it's one of those things. If you never do, you're never gonna try, and you're never gonna see the outcomes. Like you at least need to experiment to find out if you like it or not, that
Yeah.
genre, that style. And sometimes you got to go back to it a few years later when you've grown a bit, and being like, oh, now this makes sense. This is really cool. I just didn't get it because I was younger, or and just like how you outgrow styles, you like come into styles throughout your
Yeah.
ages. And well, what are some like techniques or specific maybe styles, or like maybe higher up artists, maybe not comic book related, that have really influenced your work?
When I was in eighth grade, I really got into Salvador Dali a lot.
Oh,
And that was around the time when my art teacher with the private art lessons, he was like, I get that you're obsessed with comic books, and I'm gonna try to that's what you want to do. I'm gonna push you in that direction, but it's important that you do look at some of these painters, right? So he's like, maybe you might not like some of the other stuff, you might find it boring, but this Spanish artist, like maybe you might like him because his stuff's really outer worldly. And so he showed me a couple of books on Dali, and like I fell in love with Dali. Like his surrealist work was amazing. And then from Salvador Dali, I kind of you start branching out, because he was a fine artist, right? And then you kind
hmm
of start branching out into other painters, right? And then like you find out about the history about surrealism and who they interacted with back then. And through Dali, and I ended up getting a lot into Diego Rivera, Frida Kahlo,
cool.
um, And then from there you're like, well, I love the techniques and textures, and you find out the difference between oil painting and acrylic, and Diego Rivera was one of the first to kind of use acrylic for the murals, right?
Hmm.
So from there, like you kind of start branching out. You look into other fine artists, and then next thing I knew, I was like looking at abstract expressionists like Mark Rothko and Jackson Pollock.
Cool.
And then
Yeah.
for a while there, I was like, wow, like you're this work is about color and about texture. It's not just about like correct anatomy. It's like about how
Mm.
color and texture can elicit emotion, right? So now you're like learning all these other things that to me in my mind was like important, because like how do I apply this to my work? How do I work with
Hmm.
color, right? So I was able to get into a little bit of the fine arts thanks to my art teacher. And then I was with them. I was taking lessons from him like probably 4 or 5 years. And on my fifth year, I had no idea he was into comics. I thought he was just,
Cool.
hey, tolerating my love for comics. And here's this fine artist, right? My fifth year, he's like, if you're getting older, I could use an apprentice. Come help me at the studio. You can help with mixing paints. You can help me maybe clean up, and I'll show you how I do glazes and my oil paintings. And at the studio, that like fifth year, he showed me, he's like, hey, I've known you this long. Like, I'm going to show you some stuff. He pulled out a huge box of Carl Barks Donald Duck comics. He's
Oh,
like,
rad.
I've loved comics my whole life. And like I just never told you, because like it's important you learn like the discipline of art and like brushes and painting, if it's so you can apply it to this. And he had like all these Donald Duck comics, and like the whole time I'm like, man, he's just trying to teach me painting. Like I want to do comics, and like he never brought it up at all. And then like this fifth year, he's like, yeah, I loved all this work, and I was like, wow, like. And at that point, I wasn't even into Donald Duck comics. I was like Image. I was like,
Yeah.
those '90s stuff, right? And
Yeah.
he pulls this stuff out, and I'm like, what? Like Carl Barks? He's like, no, you gotta get into Carl Barks. So when I went to college at SVA, and everybody's like, listen, guys, Carl Barks is this amazing cartoonist. You gotta check out this guy's work. I'm like, oh, I already know this. This is stuff my art was showing me, and it's just like, it's just eye-opening moments, and like a lot of cartoonists today, like I think a lot of young kids, like they get into it because they want to do superheroes, and like they want
Hmm.
to do like like the action and the fight scenes, and they don't realize there's a connection between that world and the fine arts world, right? Like, and even like the early cartoonists, like they would look up the Renaissance artists to learn correct anatomy.
Hmm.
So there's that, like, and like going back to what we were saying earlier, like a lot of like, yeah, like comic books is this macrocosm of like, all these different disciplines. So it's like you have to learn the fine art stuff. You have to learn literature, and like, really combine the two, and it's very challenging. It's a very
Yeah.
challenging medium to be working in.
That's so cool. And pulling out like, you know, that comic in general, especially when you're into like all the image stuff, like if you're reading Spawn and all those type of things, you kind of feel like, why would I even look at this? Like this
Oh
isn't
yeah,
even like
yeah.
within my interest. This is like a kid comic that like, what can I possibly learn? And for those like listeners and readers, or who haven't heard of Carl before, have seen these comics, what part of those books did you kind of pull from, and like what really stood out from you once you looked at those books that like really showed you like, oh, this is why I need to study this person?
It's going back to what we were saying earlier. It's definitely the storytelling. Like
Oh, nice.
it's engaging. Like you pick up a Carl Barks Donald Duck comic, like you can't put it down. Like it keeps you engaged. It's adventure stories. And it's told from like this very youth perspective with Huey, Dewey, and Louie, right? It's through
Hmm.
their eyes sometimes. Like a lot of the stories are through them, and it's kind of dealing with like the adventures that are the result of adults, like grown up decisions, like looking for treasure, or Uncle Scrooge, having to like not wanting to spend, right? And like it's the little kids like navigating this world, and it's just kind of, yeah, it's just these adult adventures, but like experienced through children's eyes. And like I think that's what's so engaging about those stories. And like those stories still hold up today. Like I can show these to my kids, and they'll respond to these comics more than to like a lot of the Image 90s stuff. And like, and I still look at the 90s stuff. I'm learning a lot of inking techniques from like
Oh yeah.
the Jim Lee and Rob Liefeld comics. Like a lot of their inkers were great, and I still learn from that. But I noticed that if I show those 90s comics to my kids, like they quickly lose interest. But you show them a Donald Duck comic and they're engaged. And I think it's just that the Carl Barks really had his storytelling down, and like the line work. You can learn a lot about lettering from reading those
Ooh.
comics. Like I think lettering is very important, and usually cartoonists
Mhm.
going like beginning cartoonists trying to break in like tend to be dismissive of lettering. And you read those comics, and like I think that's also part of the reason like they're so easy to engage in. Like the lettering is just so legible, and you look at a lot of work where it's just people trying to make their like 90s pastiche comic, and the lettering gets overlooked, and
Yeah.
that kind of it can take the reader out.
Yeah,
So
no, hands down. Lettering, it's one of those things we kind of talked about on the show a little bit, but it's like one of the most important parts of a book that gets overlooked. And I think the more you read comics and more you start learning how comics are made and start making your own comics, you realize like the difference between, good lettering and bad lettering, and how bad lettering can really break a book, just like how bad writing and bad art can also break a book. It's
yeah,
just as important up there. And especially when it comes down to clarity on a page, like where you're supposed to read, directions of like word balloons, and like what you're saying, storytelling itself. um when it comes down to storytelling, what do you have any advice for creators that are going into sequential art and trying to crack that code, and they're just kind of stuck in this pinup mindset, probably very new to making comics, or trying to work something out with their storytelling? What's some advice that really helped storytelling click with you?
I started out doing like 7 page. Like starting out small is usually less intimidating, and like it does kind of like it allows you to take like a small little chunk and like see how much you can say in the limited amount of space.
Hmm.
And then like, I think the beauty in the 7 page small story is that like you can start figuring out what you need and what you don't, and like kind of strip it down to like the bare essentials of what makes a story good. So you might start out with like a ton of writing and it's like very verbose, and as you're like, if you are working from a script that you wrote or someone else wrote, and you got all this right like verbose dialogue, and it's like you only have 7 pages, and it's like you only have 7 pages to show the story and the artwork and the dialogue, like you start editing it down. So I think if you're someone who's having trouble like storytelling, like maybe instead of working on 24 pages as your first story, do 7. And if you don't have an idea of how to do a 7 page story, I would recommend checking out the EC comics,
Mm,
like or the first couple of issues of Mad when it was a comic book, the Harvey
yeah.
Kurtzman stuff. They
Hmm.
tended to take a lot of stories, condense them down to 7 page. I think the Mad Harvey Kurtzman, a lot of those were movie parodies of stuff
Yeah.
that was out at the time, and they're taking like an hour and a half movie and then making a parody of that movie in 7 pages. So I think that's very helpful to look at, and you get to see what important stuff from whatever movie they're parodying, like what's the important stuff that like they managed to fit in there, and like what leave out. But I think the 7 page story is definitely like the way to go if you're having trouble, right? And because yeah, you figure out you put in the most important stuff, get rid of the rest.
There you go. Dude, I love that. And you know what? Those Mad magazines are such a great example. I used to read those as a kid like crazy. I had a little subscription some point in like, I don't remember how old I was in elementary, in like middle school, but I had stacks of Mad magazines everywhere. And I never really thought about that. You're right. Those movie parody things that they do are brilliant when it comes to stuff like that. And I remember seeing like even the superhero ones when they do Spider-Man and Batman and stuff like that. And I remember the Batman Begins one was just so fun and so entertaining. But like you could watch the movie and then go back and see how they fit it into these few pages. And that's a
Yeah,
great
yeah,
way to study, like what did they pull to like parody, and why did they pull that specific scene to make this a complete story. Like, those moments they choose are for you to have a complete idea of what's going on. It's not just like their favorite moments or anything. It's part of like the enrichment of what their craft is at that point. That's a brilliant way to kind of go about studying that aspect.
Yeah.
And so with your art, what is, especially making indie comics, like what attracts you to making your own independent books versus chasing like the wild dragon of like Marvel and DC and like the bigger companies and everything? Like what really keeps you into like independent work?
Just, I think like wanting to like, share my experiences, right? My point of view, right? Because the a lot of the Marvel stuff like is amazing. I mean, I wanted to draw comics for them and
Hmm.
DC as well, like since I was a kid. But eventually, like those fictional characters, like you can't really change them too much, right? Because like
Hmm.
they have to stay on brand. Like they can't really venture too far out. And like growing up, I think eventually you do get frustrated. It's like, all right, how many times can Peter Parker get retconned? At this point, it's been like 5 times, and it's usually it's just a retelling of the origin.
Hmm.
And so it kind of tends to get a little like repetitive. And so I was craving for like comics that are more different out, and you would think that these fictional comics would be a little bit more adventurous with like how far they can branch out with their stories, but they tend to be like really on brand. And so I think like my junior year in high school, like I was like already losing interest in the superhero stuff, and it's like, well, if I'm not finding the comics I'm craving to read, I might as well start making my own. And
Mm.
that was around the time when I was like, all right, I'm gonna stop trying to pencil sample pages from Marvel and DC. Maybe like I should just start making my own stories. And like just because the rest of the stuff got so repetitive. And I started making comics. My first series was Blazing Quantum, and that was about growing up on the border. And I tried
Cool.
to incorporate the punk scene from the border into the stories as well. And then I tried to incorporate like the history of Texas and Mexico, and like it's stuff that like I wasn't seeing at the time,
Hmm.
and I just kept drawing those comics. I got 5 issues in, and like thankfully, like I got on a couple of podcasts. I was on the Comics Alternative. They reviewed it. I got really good reviews there, and I've been at it ever since. But yeah, that's the possibilities are endless when you make or read indie comics. There's just so much work out there, and like we're in a bet. Like a lot of people say, like, oh my god, comics is failing, or like the industry is crashing, and like there's all this doom and gloom, right? But it's like, well, yeah, you're just looking at Marvel and DC, right?
Yeah.
If you go outside of Marvel and DC, like the comic book medium here in the US is like it couldn't be healthier. Like there's so
Hmm.
many diverse voices now. It's amazing. You go into Barnes and Noble or any bookstore and they have a graphic novel section. And I'm sure you remember like growing up in high school, like back
It
in the
was
90s, like
tiny.
it was
Like it was
like,
like a shelf,
yeah.
like.
And if anything, all it was like Garfield Treasury Edition, right? And like that
Yes.
was it. Now you go in, you can read about like you go into a Barnes and Noble. There's going to be a comics that are biographies on like Malcolm X.
Hmm.
You can get a comic on like the history of like the Middle East. You can get comics that are just so diverse, and and they're very informative too. There are a
Hmm.
wide range of topics now. So I would say like that's what attracts me to the indie comics is that like you can pretty much write about anything. There's no barrier, and you can
Hmm.
draw in any style. You don't have to
Yeah.
be drawing like super realistic pages. You can use a style that like would suit the story for the subject you're talking about. So
Dude, yeah, exactly. And it's funny, I just finished reading that book, The Adventures of Cavalier and Clay. And it takes place in the golden age of when comics were being made, kind of, World War One, World War II era. And even then they were saying like, oh well, comics are failing. This is gonna be our last boat, like all this type of stuff. And then, here we are, like practically, a century later, we're entering that realm of, our history into the 2000s. And it's like, you're right. You could see comics failing left and right. Marvel's doing this wrong and their shows are doing bad. And like their comics aren't selling the best and they're rebooting this and that. But like, dude, look at us here. We're doing a podcast just focused on independent creators because there's so many voices out there we're trying to bring out and highlight and give exposure to because there is so much art out there. And that's the thing. Comics are art. They're not just Marvel and DC superheroes. Comics are like the biggest way to express anything you want to say. And I think the more we realize that and the more people realize that, we're going to just have an outpour of comics. COVID kind of helped in that sense because it gave a lot of people an opportunity to be like, oh, I have time to finally sit down and draw
Yeah.
or write or make this project. But I think coming out of this whole, insanity we went through for a few years, a lot more people are realizing like, oh, there's 1,000 different types of comics. And what you're saying about Barnes and Noble, I was just at one maybe like a month ago. It's been a while because they don't really have too many where I live now, but they used to have them in El Paso. And I would just see that comic book section get bigger and
Yeah.
bigger, and hardcovers come out and then be on display. And, I still don't believe comics get the proper recognition that they deserve, but we are slowly inching our way up there into, the more mainstream universe of just like, look we're not one genre. We are anything and everything, and we welcome anyone and everything to come make and read and be inspired by this like pieces of art that we do.
Yeah,
And
it's definitely we're at a good spot, I would say. It's a good time to be a cartoonist right now, I would say.
yeah, how do you
Sub-
feel like, you know, spending your whole life making art and making comics and going to school for it? Like, what's the future holding for you, and what are you looking for as like a career in art?
so right now I'm working on the second issue of Codex of the Jaguar with writer, my co-creator of the work, Mario Martinez.
Mhm.
And yeah, we're just working on a second issue. I've been very happy with the response it's gotten. Like last year, we launched the first issue at SPX last year. I'm really happy with the response. So we're just kind of focusing on that right now. Blazing Quantum, I've always kept in print, and it's people keep buying it. I'm very fortunate that like people respond to the work. I don't know if I'll come back to it. The last issue is issue 6, and the last 2 issues of that story, I kind of changed my drawing style because I did draw them during lockdown. So I was drawing diary size because I was like, with lockdown happening, I was like, I got to put in a page a day and post on Instagram, right? And like,
Nice.
you're just trying to keep sane during lockdown. So the last 2 issues of Blazing Quantum were much differently drawn, but yeah, people responded to the work very positively. So right now it's just making comics, going forward. I don't do it full time. I wish I did, right? But I'm very lucky that I've gotten the response I've gotten so far, so.
And how do you go about like, do you crowdfund your work? What's your approach of like making all this happen? Or is a lot of it just pouring out of passion where you just like get the book done and then see
Yeah,
how
no,
the
it's
response
pouring
is?
out of passion. It's definitely pouring out of passion, and I'm very lucky that right now I do commercial art as a career, and so that kind of that does finance my comic book uh, production, right? I haven't tried Kickstarter. Like people have told me you should do Kickstarter, do one of these crowdfunding, and there's a lot of work. I've supported a couple of them, but I've just never, like, I don't know. Like my fear with the Kickstarter or crowdfunding is that like you have to hit a certain goal, right? Like in order for it to get funded.
Yeah, you set your goal too, which is cool.
Yeah.
So, like even if it's marginal, yeah.
I think my fear with that is like, well, I set myself this goal and it didn't get funded, and that like the work sometimes, like if I know myself, like I feel like if I didn't meet the crowdfunding goal, like I'd be like,
Mhm.
well, like it'd be like a like a kind of
Devastating. It's a lot.
yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I'd rather just make the work and then hope it sells, and like we'll do
Nice.
it that way, and then like that does motivate you to kind of sell them and be a good salesperson because you've already invested your own money into getting it done. So now if you just let them sit there, like you're not motivated, like you're more if you I feel like if you invest your own money, you're more for me personally, I'm more motivated to go to comic shops and like, hey, do you want to carry my comic? Like, can you do a 50% retailer discount? Do you want to do co-assignment? And like, yeah, it does motivate me to go into the shop every week and like, hey, how's my comic doing? And I've
Nice.
been lucky, like they've been selling. I'm lucky that I live on the East Coast and that like I have access to comic shops here that do carry my work. So it's
Yeah.
just
Dude, I was just in New York recently, well, back in April, and I try to visit whenever I can. Seeing that I'm so close and I have some friends up there, but places like Desert Island and Forbidden Planet are just so awesome on just like wanting to take in work and supporting independent creators. They are, of course, bigger, I think widely known shops. Desert Island is just like purely focused on mostly like independent work, which
yeah,
is rad. But just getting your book into those cool legendary shops, it's just such a win. And I think a lot of creators, I encourage them like insanely to go out to these shops and find them and talk to these owners and try to get your book in there, because not only is there a reward of getting your book in your hands and like knowing you made your own comic, but whenever you go to a shop and you see your book on the shelves like
yeah.
with other people and other artists that you admire or love, dude, it's unreal. Like it's one of the coolest feelings I've ever had in my life. And I'm like, okay, I gotta just keep doing this. I'm not gonna
Yeah,
get
yeah,
tired of
no,
just
there's
doing it
no
all.
there's no greater high. There's no greater
Yeah.
high. I will say that I agree 100%. There's no greater high than seeing your book on a comic book store, a favorite comic store, right? And
Mhm.
then like you're like, oh my god, that's so awesome. And then you go back and like there's no more on the shelf, and it's like, well, now I got to go see if they want to buy more and cross your fingers, and yeah, sometimes yeah they'll buy more, and then it's like you want to keep chasing that high, and so it becomes this thing where you become self motivated to keep producing more work, right? And then finding out what's selling, what doesn't, right? Because I've noticed that I think Blazing Quantum #3 is the one that like I have the most copies of, and
Mhm.
it's the one I feel that like, oh, I poured my heart and soul into issue #3 because it's a very personal story, and like I had to do a lot of research for like #3, and it's the one that like I have the most copies of. But issues 1, 2, 4, like all the other ones tend to do pretty well, right? So it's like
Yeah.
also it becomes this learning thing of like finding out what sells, what doesn't, and then like taking those lessons with you, and then just kind of use them to go forward when you produce your work, right? But it's always that thing, like you think your best work is going to do great and it doesn't, and then you think your worst work isn't going to sell, and then it's the one that sells the most,
Yep.
right? It's this learning thing. It's like sometimes we can be our own worst critics, right? But and then you're surprised how people react to one's work.
That's such a good lesson too. And for people to really remember, like you are your own risk critic and you are harder on yourself than anyone else. And dude, I kind of love hearing that, to be honest. Like your favorite best thing is kind of your worst seller, but like everything else is doing awesome. And you're like, dang, I don't get why, but like
Yeah,
this
yeah.
is the one I wanted to like really kick ass and it doesn't. And it's one of those artistic things that, I was talking to Adrian Kolerick about this too when he was talking about his book, because like sometimes people don't get it right away and it just needs to sit there and people catch up to that work or that storyline or what's going on there. And sometimes when it's not a hit right off the bat, for some reason 5-10 years later it's the best thing ever, and you're like, this has been there for a while,
Yeah.
guys. Like,
And
it just takes a while for the world to catch up to you in a
there's
sense.
a lot of work like that. For example, the one "I shall destroy all planets" or "I shall destroy
Mhm.
all civilized planets." I mean
Mhm.
that was like a what golden age book that like that was published by like a fourth rate publisher, and like
Oh, wow.
years years go by. It's like more than 50 years, and then Dre Moriarty, another cartoonist, he found it and he was like, no, this is amazing, it's genius. And then it got reprinted because so many people like were
Mhm.
looking at it through Jerry's recommendation, and you look at these comics and like, yeah, they're just so insane, and like the anatomy is just ridiculous,
Mhm.
and they didn't sell well back in the golden age. Now they got reprinted because it's like it took more than 50 years for people to like be like, no, this guy was a genius,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, it's I mean, and that's unfortunate with a lot of artists today, like or back then, like Van Gogh, same thing,
Mm.
it
Yep.
took past him dying for people to realize his genius. So I think that's the thing. Like we are our own worst critics, but we got to remember that like it does take a while for people to catch up to what you're trying to say sometimes, you know.
I love it, dude. William, dude, this has been a very enlightening and exciting conversation. Dude, you've given us so much info and so many things to look into, but also like a different perspective to look at our art and kind of a way of being as we create comics. Why don't you tell us where to find you and what you're going to be up to in 2024?
Right now, I am currently, I applied to table at KAIS, the Kingston Independent Comics Expo. That's April 27th. I'm going to be there between 10 and 6. That's in Kingston, New York again. My handle is at Keops Ibanez. That's on Instagram and Tumblr. And yeah, I'm just going to be making Blazing Quantum #2 currently. No, not Blazing Quantum. I'm sorry. Codex of the Jaguar #2 with writer Mario Martinez. So yeah, that's pretty much it. It's just keep drawing comics, keep reading comics too. So
I love it. Dude, you are super inspirational. I can't wait to dive more into your work. And next time I'm like near New York or something, I'll definitely hit you up. We'll definitely
yeah,
try to
definitely,
check out
Mike, give me
something.
a shout out. Yeah, I'm totally
We'll
down.
get some books, check out a museum or something. Like we'll definitely talk some craft some more. I
Yeah,
would absolutely
absolutely,
love
man.
that.
Cool.
Dude, thank you for your time. And for all you watchers and listeners out there, don't forget to like, subscribe, share, check out the survey at the bottom for, any feedback we could get on the show, and, keep up with all the current Kickstarters that we highlight and we talk about as well. So, thanks for hanging, keep on creating and stay inspired.
Awesome, man. Thank you.
Thank you. Looking for high quality printing, fast turnaround, and the industry's best customer service? Look no further than Comics Wellspring. Trusted by thousands of indie comic creators, Comics Wellspring has proven to be the go to comic book printer. So when you're ready to bring your comic books to life, go to comicswellspring.com and be sure to check out one of the best platforms to sell your physical and digital comics online, the CWS Bookstore. Remember to subscribe, hit that notification bell to see our lives come out twice every single week on YouTube and podcast platforms. And also tag us when you share your favorite episodes and moments from the show. And remember, creators, thanks for hanging, keep creating, and stay inspired.